هذا ما أشار له المسؤولون العسكريون.
The United States is in a state of confusion and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that the majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı. Ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Welcome to Varn Blog. Today I'm here with Parker McQueeny on the coordinating committee for the Marxist Unity slate over at the DSA, and also in the executive committee for the DSA and
River Valley, which is in Western Mass.
In Western Massachusetts. Thank you, Parker. All right. Parker, you've been on one of my shows many moons ago, back when I was still doing Symptomatic Redness for Zero Books early on. So that was probably about 3 years ago. Nice to have you back. Originally, this was proposed as a panel. I decided not to do it as a panel, but it'll be a reoccurring series. And you came on to argue about working within the DSA to change it. I am not here to debate you. I want people to know that, but this will be a slightly more, not antagonistic, but interrogative series of questions. Cool. And I think what people need to understand for the future is, hopefully we hear this when people come in a couple of months, I'll give them the context for why we decided to talk about this, and then what's happened actually in the interim between when we agreed to do this and last week. So I said something snarky on Twitter, as many things go, about the Bowman affair. And I have maintained my stance of staying outside of the DSA because the Nationals' commitment to the Democrats has only intensified, actually, despite some other issues. I don't think that actually is reflective of what I've seen from informal polls out of the DSA for the DSA's actual membership, though. In fact, I would say that the membership's actually moving in the opposite direction. But the Jamal Bowman affair, and for those of you who don't know, that had to do with Jamal Bowman's support of funding for basically Israeli aid against one of the few platforms the DSA is very clear on, which is the BDS platform, that was voted in popularly, was really divisive amongst membership of the DSA. Now, as a side note, ultimately, I'm not sure that I think the Bowman affair is actually all that important, but it did illustrate that the planks of the DSA were not a program that they could even reliably hold the MPC to. So we sat that down, and I continue my agnostic stance on the DSA, but very critical. In the foregoing month, what we've seen is the MPC's own report saying that they have lost about 1/5 of their membership in, now it's unclear because of how they count this when this decline started. The lapsed category is only like 7,000 people, but the expired category is about 12,000 people. Together, that is about 2,100. That's a fifth of the DSA's membership as far as the membership as counted at the convention in November. I believe it was, yes, in November. The interesting thing is, while it's very hard to get the exact months down, and even the reports I've read from the NPC is rather vague, it looks like the great majority of those people left after the Bowman affair, because the expired membership category, I think, depending on when they take the count, and they did say there's still some oversight issues with certain chapters, can be as it can be like a few months before you show up on that, but you can also show up in a month. So it's hard to know what's actually prompting the exodus. Is it just, the general malaise? Is it the same kind of thing that, the recent Jacobin magazine cover has been about? So that's the framing. That's how we got here. I also wanted to point out that since you are coming in arguing for the Marxist Unity slate, that you actually are, in many ways, even though Marxist Unity slate had some successes at the convention, your larger platform is not the platform of the NPC right now in general. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, so let me just go back for a second here.
Go ahead.
Sorry that you froze a couple times during that thing. I don't know if it's my internet connection, but if I interrupt you at any point,
that's fine.
I just apologies in advance. But so yeah, Marxist Unity, something. Sorry, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Can you? Am I coming through? Okay, good. Okay, so yeah, we formed for the convention around 7 or 8 people. We had a slate of 3 proposals, one of which did make it to the convention floor, and it was debated, but it failed, which we expected it to do. We were only 7 people. And also our platform amendment did not make it to the floor. So none of those things became policy. But at the same time, I personally was a member of the committee that wrote the subcommittee that wrote the platform. And we had a lot of people, there was a big, in that platform subcommittee, there was a process for members to submit criticism of the first draft, to submit suggestions and stuff like that. And then various discussions on the platform at pre-convention. So I would say that we did have some political influence on the platform. Although I guess what we were arguing for is that coming up with some kind of programmatic document that does describe the actual politics of DSA members is the most important step forward at the moment. Because not qualifying that means that we can basically continue our opportunistic stance, strategic stance towards electoral politics, labor politics, all sorts of things. So the idea was that we have a platform, and then once we have this platform that actually says what our actual politics are, stuff like anti-NATO, just basic swing positions that are not necessarily, allowed to be had in like polite society, right? Once we have those set out in an official document, it's going to create some kind of contradiction between, the actual electoral strategy we've been pursuing and what our actual political goals are. And I think the Bowman affair situation kind of proved that correct, in that people were using the platform as justification for criticism of Bowman. So I guess I would just say our goals going forward are to put forward a kind of better qualitative rather than a kind of quantitative, as many wins as we can get, but rather put forward candidates who actually are willing to stand for our program and kind of practice politics in the way that Marxism classically did, which was as mainly an agitational and a propagandistic tool to raise the raise the expectations of the working class, rather than form backroom, horse trading to get on committees to become, an appendage of the Democratic Party sort of thing. So
right. So you and I actually on this probably agree a lot, actually, on what the actual flaws of the current MPC are. And for those of you who don't know the MPC is basically the elected coordinating committee at the national level. There's also the director who is unelected, but definitely sees professional staff. One of the issues that you have increasingly in the DSA is there's volunteer, electorate, and professional staff, and they operate in parallel paths, although technically Maria Svart, the director, is serves at the behest of the MPC, but since she's become the director, I have no MPC has said much about her performance, nor do I know that it's actually bad. I mean, it's just a thing to notice that she's a pretty constant for the past 5 or 6 years sports at the national level. Yeah, go ahead.
There has been some controversy over this, actually. So Maria Spar, I believe she became the national director in 2010, and obviously DSA was a qualitatively different.
Yeah, it was at like the 4,000 to 5,000. Yeah, excuse me. Was that like the 4,000 to 5,000?
It was
member level.
It was a glorified mailing list of the old timers who were members at Harrington's point. As far as the current NPC goes, I would say that it's not just a problem of who was elected to the NPC, but the fact that DSA is very decentralized in a manner of speaking, although it's being fixed in some ways. So it's not necessarily a problem just at the top, but kind of organizationally the whole way through. Anyway, that was kind of beside the point of the whole national director situation. But comrades from Bread and Roses Caucus have been kind of peeved at politically for the last couple of years because she hasn't hired a labor director. And I don't know the kind of backroom politics behind this, but they've been wanting a labor staffer for a long time. So they put a resolution at convention to elect the national director. It lost because, in my opinion, because they didn't campaign on the political problems with the national director. They just made it a case of kind of vague democracy. So yeah, the NPC does have the power to fire the director, but I guess they didn't want to. They thought it would be a bad look or something. But I don't know. I don't know what the specific details about the issues, but if there are real political issues, I think people should be unafraid to raise that specter, because no one should be in the national director of a quasi mass socialist organization as a career life choice. That's something you do for a couple of years and then move on.
Right, and she's been there now for a decade, and from before the big explosion in 2015. Couple of things that I want to clarify for our listeners who may not be as familiar with the structure of the DSA. The DSA's constitution was slightly reformed in the convention in 2019. However, most of the org structure goes all the way back to Harrington, and 84, I believe, is when it split from the U.S. Social Democrats or whatever. And one of the interesting things about that is the DSA is highly federated.
72 was.
Yeah, was 72 is the split from so it
Sorry.
doesn't really. Yeah, okay.
And 83 is the merger with NAM.
Yeah, 83 is when it becomes what we think of as a DSA, right? So, and when that happens, it goes up to 5,000 members in the light of Reagan's re-election, and then basically plateaus there for 30 years, which is, it. And I've known about the DSA since like 2005 or 6, but if you'd have told me in 2005 that it would have been the largest socialist organization in America, I would have laughed at you. So I guess my prediction rate is not always stellar. But the DSA has a highly federated system, but it's federated in a weird way. It's basically municipal, national. There's the 80-20 due split. There isn't regional coordinating committees, which I know, like the defunct Collective Power Caucus was really big on this. And in the lieu of those regional coordinating committees, the caucus system's kind of been around, but I think almost all the caucuses are in the last, 6 or 7 years, right? All the major ones. There's none that go back to the pre-Bernie times.
I believe
Are there?
I believe so. So there was a thing called Left Caucus from 2015, which was before the big blow up. And I think that Bread and Roses can trace its organizational roots to there, or at least maybe the Jacobin people, maybe more accurately. Like I'm pretty sure Bhaskar Sunkara was involved in Left Caucus before DSA blew up.
Right.
But pretty much it would be accurate to say that that pretty much all the caucuses are part of the new DSA. North Star, which is kind of the fringe right wing, I hate to say this, but the boomer kind of ex-new communist movement people who wrote the letter chastising DSA for not supporting Biden more. That group is mostly people who have been involved in the left for 5 decades. Some of them have been DSA members for decades, but I don't know. I don't think they were organizationally together in a caucus until 2016 or something.
So we have coalitions of regional orgs, and you have the caucuses. I remember Left Caucus. I also remember Refoundation. A bunch of the early caucuses have splintered into many things. But what has been clear to me is the caucuses originally didn't play that huge of a role in DSA culture. And in the lieu of regional development, I mean, and also like there are I think the caucus system would have happened anyway, but they've become really, really important as a way to organize beyond the local chapters, because there isn't really an intermediary organization that's really active outside of the convention. And the convention is every 2 years, right? Now,
Yep.
Yeah. Funding for the DSA is interesting. It's 80-20. 80% goes to the national, 20% goes to local. There have been resolutions, I think resolution 30 and 33, that actually increase funding for locals through matching funds and some other stuff. So the 80-20 is not perfect. For those of you who want to know what most of the DSA's money goes to, I've actually looked over it. Other than the large number of consultants the DSA hires for things that are not entirely clear, most of the money collected by the DSA and its $6.9 million budget, million, is actually spent on the operations of the DSA. And when you also consider the average cost of living and the fact that DSA only does union shop, employees are a large part of their cost, and that's justifiable. Also, the NPC is now paid, but not a lot. It's not a lot of money at all. It's basically a stipend for their time, one that is low enough that one would not want to become a career NPCer from their money. So I say all that because it's easy to mischaracterize that, and I want people to understand that structure. The bylaws of the DSA are strange in that sometimes local chapters can get out of them, which is nutty to me. So with chapter writes its own bylaws, it submits them to the DSA, and sometimes they can exempt themselves from national bylaws, which is weird. The most common example of that is the Democratic Centralist ban, which is from way back. It's from like the early 80s, or maybe even back all the way to 72. From the SPA split is where its origins supposedly come, because it's also, ironically, the Dimsent ban was also until recently in the SPUSA too, so it goes really far back. So it's actually a pre-DSA thing. So someone says only the steering committee is paid, which is 5 of the 16 NPCs. So it's a very small. It's not a huge portion, and it's not enough that I think anyone would want to do it professionally. But the director is professional. There's a professional staff. There's lots of, and again, this is just from the public records of the NPC meeting. There's lots of weird debates about like volunteer staff versus professional staff, and like professional staff being mad that volunteer staff tells them what to do, and I'm just like, okay. So there's all that. The other thing that we need to be clear on is, I don't know for all chapters, but I do know out here in Salt Lake that paper members outnumber regular attending members like 5 to 6 to 1. So whenever we had, I say we, I'm not a member, but whenever I would go to even a large DSA gathering, which would be like 100 people here in SLC, there was probably 600 people on roll that could go to that event. So these are all the structural things. So you kind of get a feel for the landscape of what we're talking about here. What the NPC spends money on beyond operational costs does seem to be mostly lobbying and like grants to DSA candidates. And this is where I'm going to ask Parker to comment a little bit more in a minute, but the grants are super low. It's like $7,000 or so. Like, and if you're in a very low key uncontested city council seat, yeah, that'll help you out. It's a serious amount of money. If you're in in SLC in my district, we had like, in this, it's not a huge city. We had a contested city council seat, and all of a sudden hundreds of thousands of dollars are running into the city council seat. All right. So I point that out because it's just enough of amount of money to cost the DSA a fair amount of money off of its operational budget, but not enough where I think it could sway someone to take a stronger stance against Democratic Party politics, because it's not gonna intervene beyond other donors. That's my point. And for the money, the electoral stuff is incredibly expensive. The DSA is not misleading you on that. So I wanted to say all that in fairness to the DSA. Okay. Why do you think the DSA should still be the organization that we focus on the left, given everything I just said, and that now it's hemorrhaging members?
Right. Yeah. That's a good question. And I definitely agree with a lot of your criticisms put forward. I guess what I would say, and what, most of the other members of the organizing committee of Marxist Unity Group would say, is that there's kind of this, ultra left truism, or kind of a workerist truism, that says, screw the left sucks. You have to go to where the workers are.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, I'm frozen again. Okay, I'm back. And I think that attitude kind of isolates everyone, and means you don't necessarily have a clear programmatic politics to bring to people. So you can spend all your life on the factory floor as a cell of 5 militant communists or whatever, but you're going to have a hard time merging, the working class militancy with the actual socialist program. So I think, I would say follow the Iskra strategy, right? Lenin's strategy of the early 20th century, which is intervene in the debates going on in the socialist press, in the socialist left. Fight the opportunism that exists there, put it on the right programmatic path, and okay, it's like I'm freezing a lot. Sorry here, but my
okay.
my point is that when you gather your troops in one place, have an effective battle strategy, and then go into battle, right? So I think it's true that DSA has been hemorrhaging people. I'm actually surprised it's so few, because there are big chapters that haven't been able to reach their quota at general meetings. I think quota, it's probably, like you said, bylaws are different for every chapter, but I think it's generally like something like 20% of membership, which means
Right.
that the executive committees have to do like outreach to make sure enough people are coming to general meetings to reach quota so that they can actually get business work done.
Yes, they can actually vote.
Exactly. I would personally favor a model that had tighter membership. Like I would personally favor something like only have people who are willing to pay monthly dues, blah blah blah. But I think the vast majority of DSA members want there to be kind of a low barrier to access. And there are benefits and drawbacks of that. I mean, I think when you do have an exciting campaign going on and there's someone really great running for a seat somewhere, it might be easy to get some of the less active members to come out for a canvass or something. But another thing I want to point out is that just over the pandemic, I think a lot of people got burned out of going to constant Zoom meetings, Zoom for school, Zoom for a DSA meeting. It kind of sucks, honestly. And personally, I kind of burned out on Zoom meetings over the pandemic and wasn't attending my chapter stuff. Although I was doing the stuff with the platform committee on the national level, I was not very active in my chapter. But with this whole Bowman affair thing, with the whole debates going on around Bowman's vote for the Iron Dome funding, I think a lot of chapters were kind of reinvigorated by having actual political debate and discussion, which is something that the kind of people on the right who were opposing expulsion for Bowman said the opposite would happen. Oh, it's focusing us on inward pains. But in my chapter particularly, we had a resolution come to our general meeting, and it was our first general meeting back in person, off Zoom. And we had something like 75 people come, which was a lot more than we had over the last year. And I think people were really excited to debate it. The resolution lost by 1 vote. But I wasn't really disappointed with that, because I think our job, like our struggle for an actual effective Marxist strategy in the US left is an uphill battle. And I don't think it's something we're going to win right away. But, the idea is to have a kind of strategy of attrition to convince as many people on the left to have a principled approach. I think eventually it's going to come to a head. But until then, you try to win as many people over to a principled approach as you can. So I think, where else other than DSA is activity happening?
Well, I guess the question becomes, where does activity continue to happen? And I say this because the one thing I will say is the DSA doesn't really have a clear national strategy campaign other than 2 Democratic Party talking points, and it. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
All right.
Yeah. So sorry, I thought you were continuing. Should I go?
Go ahead.
Yeah,
No,
I think there's a bit of combined and uneven development. Sorry, my internet issues are kind of crapping out here. But yeah, I was just going to say, I think there's a bit of combined and uneven development going on with DSA. Like the New York chapter is like way bigger proportionally than any other DSA chapter, and they actually have a bench of electeds in the New York State Assembly and the State Senate, actually. And they're really the only place where DSA, at least on a state level, has like a disciplined fraction within a legislature, which is kind of the classical Marxist approach. But at the same time, you know, the Socialist Caucus is unofficial, you know, so there's no actually mechanical structures that tie those electeds to the party platform, to the state leadership or whatever. Like you said, there isn't even a state leadership in New York. And also they're members of the Democratic Caucus. Now, I would argue that, you know, fine, it's easier to get elected on it, or basically impossible to not get elected outside of the major ballot line or whatever. But I think the real disciplinary mechanisms of the major capitalist parties are in the caucus. So you could get elected on the Democratic ballot line and refuse to join the caucus and only caucus with other socialists. I think that would be a plausible way to go forward, at least until, you know, they make laws to disallow that from happening. That's not what DSA is currently doing, but that's what I think Marxist Unity would argue for.
One thing I would bring up is that the Democratic Party's local apparatus in most states outside of New York and California is actually quite weak. But it's also quite easy for the Democratic kind of national to cut off fundings because of that. And we've seen that when DSAs take over small states, Democratic caucus. It's happened once.
Yep. Yeah, it happened in Nevada. And I think the DSA members in Nevada were, so there's been some kind of strategy debate in DSA around these questions of, oh, do we support, quote unquote, the dirty break, or do we support, quote unquote, what was it called? Party surrogate.
Yeah, the party surrogate strategy.
The people in Nevada were the people claiming.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Right. Yeah. The people in Nevada were the ones following the party surrogate strategy, which says, oh, the Democratic Party isn't a real party, so we can just put our members in and, you know, use the Democratic Party form, but have the socialist content without ever having to break and form a labor party, which I think is the majority of dirty break people want a bourgeois labor party rather than a socialist party even. And there was a lot of nationally, there was a lot of criticism of the people in Nevada for that because of what you just said. And I think the dirty break people were actually pretty opposed to taking over state Democratic parties. And then you have the former CPN was in favor of party surrogate, and I think also Socialist Majority Caucus was in favor of party surrogate. So they were pushing for the state takeover of Democratic parties.
In the sense that American parties have a history of being empty voter-based machines and have no function like the traditional socialist parties of Europe did, I see some of the party surrogate point, but in general, that strategy seems to deny the power of the Democratic National Convention. Which seems easy to lose all your funding.
Exactly. And the people who are arguing for party surrogate, actually, you know, I would say that our position is to go for the party surrogate model, at least on the short term, but actually do it, which means hold people accountable to the platform, actually have disciplinary mechanisms like the German Social Democrats did in the late 19th century, like the Bolsheviks did in the Tsarist Duma. But no one was really arguing for that. So I think that's the argument we're trying to put forward. Of course, we do think that we need to eventually have our own legal shell as well. And if that means, you know, I think like I said earlier, people are addicted to winning as much as possible rather than winning as well as possible, right? So I think we would argue for better but fewer.
The common thing you're going to get thrown back at you is, how is this not going to end up like the Green Party or the current attempt at the People's Party or whatever? I mean, there is a history of third parties, and before the mid 1990s, they were actually threats. But the state level party conventions in almost all the states rewrote the laws, got them through state legislature. And while it's not impossible to get third party county, and it's in a local or state legislature or even on the ballot, it's very hard for them to effectively access normal democratic levers of power, and that was bipartisan after the Ross Perot campaign. I find it, I mean, it is a bind, right? Because one of the things you would argue for the dirty break would be to have a state by state level program plank with an immediate demand to parliamentarize, parties in a way where states actually would have, fair party representation for their public, and workers' parties would be fairly represented. But I haven't seen anybody in the DSA like take a state level plank on what kind of reforms it would be asking for. All I get is some stuff about the PRO Act or repealing Taft-Hartley or something, which is important, but not enough.
Right. Well, yeah, that's an example of how the U.S. federal system really fucks with strategy and makes it more difficult and complicated. I think, Seth Ackerman's piece from, what was it, 2016 or early 2017 about the ballot and the break, I think it's called, details all these legal hurdles. And it kind of was the genesis of the whole talk about the dirty break and the party surrogate. But yeah, I think, going back to an earlier point about state level structures, I think one thing that would help, and is actually starting to happen, is forming these, like California DSA just formed, I believe. But crucially also forming like policy platforms to fight for, political democratization, so that we actually can have, a viable socialist party come around. But at the same time, like I was saying earlier, I'm fine with doing party surrogate for now, as long as we actually do party discipline. We reject all discipline of the Democratic Party, even if we're using their legal ballot line. And while we do that, fight for both state level and national, political reforms, multi-member districts, ranked choice voting, stuff like that. Which is all in the national DSA platform. Here in Massachusetts, we endorsed the ranked choice voting ballot measure last year, or maybe it was 2020. It failed. I can't remember by how much. But yeah, I would say, and I think right now, a lot of the political reform stuff that DSA officially endorses is kind of just talk. People don't see it as important because they think, oh, we can just keep kind of tailing progressive Democrats for now. So I would say that, go back and read Lenin on what is to be done, and two tactics of social democracy and the Democratic Revolution, and just you get a sense of how important political agitation and like actual politics over the actual political part of the program over the economic part of the program was, like how important that was to Lenin and Bolshevism.
The one thing I would say in response to that, though, is neither political determination nor economic determination actually led to the Bolshevik Revolution. It was like specifically being the strongest faction in a state of high entropy due to Tsarist mistakes and Lenin's rightful embrace of the Semawald left, and increasing the pointing out how bad the contradictions were for the working class in the war, and supporting defeatism for all imperial powers. There's nothing like that on the table in the American context.
Right. We're in the context of we need to be party building. And that's why I look so much to the party building era of Lenin's writing, like the early 1900s, because, only a party that has roots in the working class, that has principled programmatic politics, can take advantage of an opportunity when one inevitably arises because of all the various crises that capitalism engenders, right? Economic crises, climate crises, political crises, whatever. Those are inevitable. I don't think socialism is inevitable, but crisis is, and it's either socialism or barbarism, right? Like the quote at the beginning of your introduction states. And I think only a principled Marxist party can take advantage of a revolutionary situation. But without a revolutionary situation, we need to be focusing on building a revolutionary party.
Okay. One thing I would ask is, does the Dirty Blake strategy with the Democrats also make a certain logic within the DSA itself? When would you want to... I mean, I guess a platform would do it, actually. It would actually force what would amount to probably a split.
Right. I mean, so here's the thing about the Dirty Break. The official, explanation of the Dirty Break is that it's actually more influenced by the history of the UK Labour Party than it is by, an actual Marxist party. And I think the idea, it comes from kind of a certain brand of Trotskyism that says what Marxists can do is become a faction within a bourgeois labor party, right? Which is that not only the British Trotskyists that came out of the, Ted Grant, CWI/IMT tradition, but even in the U.S., the Draper-Chapman tradition was deep, and I think the SWP tradition too was.
Yeah, both the Cliffite and the Draper tradition held that idea that you needed to form a workers' party and a socialist tendency within it, which the Trotskyist tendency would liquidate itself into.
Yeah, exactly.
But we have to remember this was also when the CPUSA was a mass party.
What we call the merger formula, right? It's actually a failure.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
It's okay. Go ahead. The merger formula, ...
Right. Yeah, exactly. Mass in maybe a similar... Sorry, my internet's freezing again here. Anyway, the point is that, we see this idea of forming a labor party that can repeal and replace the Democratic Party as one of the major two parties is kind of a setting ourselves up for failure. I think our view is that we need to form, a programmatically communist party, a mass party that has a clear vision for the working class taking power in society, which means, having a minimum platform that calls for, political revolution. Obviously, a bourgeois labor party is not going to do that. They're going to say we want to, rule capitalism within the constitutional framework, maybe in a more equitable way. But I would say, you know, why not focus on the, you know, 10% of Americans who have a positive reaction to the word communism? You know, why not try to get representation for that 10% and programmatically, you know, have a programmatically clear party, you know, maybe a minority mass party, but if a Labor Party does form, you know, if there are, you know, sections of the working class that do ever see it necessary to form a bourgeois Labor Party, we could affiliate with them in the classic, you know, United Front tactic. But I think, you know, you're already liquidating politically if you aim for building a Labor Party, you know, a major party to win next government, rather than a maybe smaller but more effectively political communist party.
I will say this though, but it became pretty clear that the DSA strategy was none of those things, including the party surrogate or the Ackerman plan, which has seemed to fall out of favor in the last year. It was the semi-post facto explanation of Adolf Reed that we needed a Bernie movement to have a political movement, to cause a workers' movement, to have a political movement, to have social. I mean, the number of steps involved in this, and the fact that it was literally a top-down failure, bottom-up, some kind of weird twist, figure eight Mobius strip strategy. And that was the actual strategy that they embarked on. There was no real attempt to even build the party surrogacy beside these, you know, certain small state parties. Like, I think about the amount of energy that was spent on debates around the squad, which was a way, for example, if I wanted to, I could make a ton of money as a streamer doing that shit. But it was totally missing the broader point of what kind of representation could you have? How could you hold these people accountable when you can't even create a program for yourself for as a grounds for leftist unity in the first place? You have no functional definition of what counts as left. And that's a problem.
Yeah, I think in a big way it was a relationship of convenience with the squad, right? I mean, you know, we have our stated strategy, and then AOC wins this huge upset primary victory. Oh, look, she's a member of DSA, and DSA was involved in the campaign. How many tens, like 15,000 people sign up for DSA right after that, right? It's a major media victory. So obviously you don't want to say, well, you know what, we were actually just a small part of the AOC coalition. You know, really the main thing behind her is Justice Democrats, and whatever else there is. You know, I don't really know what. I'm not in New York, so I don't know.
Democrats, local stuff. The Ted Kennedy campaign, since he was a former staffer.
Of these. Exactly. Yeah. And then what happens is people think of these people as DSA candidates when they're really not, because DSA didn't have the capacity to win a congressional campaign on a national level. And so, but there's a positive media spin for DSA to have that kind of opacity there, to have people think that, oh yeah, this is DSA, join DSA, you get a bunch of new people. But in reality, they're not accountable to our platform. They're not accountable to our leadership at all. You know, and I think that's becoming more and more clear to DSA members, and we're not going to have these easy mass recruitment PR victories that we've had in the past. And even though that might mean fewer people signing up, that might mean we aren't actually going to get to 100,000 real members anytime soon. I do think that it puts us in a positive direction to actually realize that we need to be putting forward the type of people who are accountable to our politics, and B, that, we can actually do that. And we have done that on the local and state level. And we need to make that policy. So yeah, I think it's a positive. I think we're moving in a positive direction, actually, even though, it's true what Trotsky said, right? That to overestimate your numbers and your strength is actually a weakness. And I think it's the last couple of years has shown in what respects that has been a weakness for us.
Well, the jump from 50 to like 90,000 should have worried us when it happened during COVID, and there was nothing for those people to do. I mean, that's
that too. Yeah,
that's a big thing right now. Is I'm like, there might be some stuff for locals to do, maybe, but it seems right now. I was reading the NPC's call for a big national recommitment campaign, but they have none of their own agenda items to put forward for that campaign. And what I predict you kind of hinted at is correct, that because it's harder to get quorum, and because it's actually kind of hard to fall off the rolls of DSA, that unless something really changes in the next 6 months, I think we'll see that number double. But again, the high point of DSA action was not the high point of DSA membership. You would actually just be going back to the like 2019, 2018 level.
right. Yeah, I generally think, a lot of DSA members are, swayed by the numbers. Like if we're losing members, it's always a bad thing. And I think that's true to an extent, because, you don't want people burnt out. You want to have your network of contacts, people who are sympathetic and who are maybe willing to show up for something. But at the same time, I think, practically, if you're going to be a cadre organization that actually does real work in the world, you need to vet people a little bit. And I don't know, I haven't thought about this much. I don't know if I would support a kind of 2-tier membership structure or what. But numbers isn't everything. And when you grow really fast in a short period of time, it just has positives and negatives. You need to educate people. And I think in the last 5 years, people's political education has really matured a lot. But at the same time, you have new members coming in, and you don't have really any consistent program for, teaching them about socialism. So, yeah, I think, even if quantitatively DSA isn't growing, I think that doesn't mean it can't qualitatively. And I think once we get our qualitative issues sorted out, I think that would put us on good footing to grow quantitatively.
All right. We have one last question, and then I'll let you go. Thank you for your time, Parker. This is from the listener Backcountry. What would be the bridge too far for continued involvement in the DSA? At what point would the DSA left need to consider bailing?
Right. Well, I think, the quote unquote DSA left has never really cohered into a real thing. There were lots and lots of different groups that consider themselves on DSA left, and groups outside of DSA that consider themselves 2 DSAs left, but who disagree on 500,000 things. That being said, I think if there were another socialist organization that came up that had the potential that DSA does, that had the number of chapters it had, it would be worth orienting towards that. I mean, part of Cosmonaut magazine, we oriented towards Marxist Center Group, even though they were much smaller, because we found the idea of uniting groups on the far left attractive. And again, I would say that, DSA, one of the good things about it is it does have these kind of democratic internal structures in the sense that you can form a faction and you can argue for your politics. I think there have been some chapters where there are, concerns about, bureaucratic maneuvering and stuff like that. But I would say the vast majority of chapters, that's not true. On the national level, that's not true. And as long as it's the, largest place of the socialist left in the US, and B, that you have the ability to agitate for principled politics, I would say that that's probably a good bet that that's the best place to be, at least on the political level. There may be a trade union that's worth engaging with on a practical level, like UE, United Electric, the ILWU, the nurses union. I think those are the most radical trade unions in the U.S. And DSA does have really good relationships with those unions from what I know, especially the nurses and UE. But if another theoretical situation, if DSA did get its cadre members elected to Congress or something, and they ended up violating principles in a big way, and the leadership got behind it and all the membership got behind it, I would say not necessarily to leave, but to make a big stink about it until you get kicked out. So it really depends on the situation. But, just think about the Labour Party in the UK right now. I think it was there's a group called Labour Against the Witch Hunt and Labour in Exile Network that just voted to merge and now are operating totally outside the Labour Party. The Labour Party has totally eviscerated its left, but I think it was the wrong move to now for Labour Against the Witch Hunt to operate outside of it, because now there's no one left to kind of speak up against the witch hunt. If you don't know, it was groups like Socialist Appeal, basically anyone who defended people who were kicked out for supposed anti-Semitism, which is really just defending Palestine. I don't know. I would just say that in general, if you have a mass organization of the left, it makes sense to argue your position until you get kicked out.
The last question I have, this is my own, and it came up as you were discussing this. Unfortunately, the DSA left, even if its members would actually show up in two sections of the Pew poll, the outsider left and the progressive left. For people who don't know what I'm talking about, there's a recent Pew poll typology of people's gradients of left and right. I tried to take it. I don't know that it's super helpful. But the one thing I will say is the progressives are both the smallest and most unpopular faction of the ideological spectrum in the United States, regardless of racial identity or this, that, and the other. How would the DSA differentiate themselves from that when their national level candidates seem like representatives of said faction?
Okay, sorry, I haven't seen this Pew poll, and you froze again a little bit while you were discussing that. Can you just kind of repeat the question?
Sure, I can repeat it. I said that there was a Pew poll that figured out both the popularity and the relative size of like 10 factums on a spectrum, the left to right. There were two categories in where Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren supporters showed up, which is already telling you how a problem you're going to have with this poll. But it was the outsider left, which is relatively popular in about 10% of the population. And then there's the progressive left, which is about 6% of the population, extremely unpopular. Nobody seems to like them. But the representatives that the DSA has aligned themselves with are strongly seen as representatives of the progressive left by the general public. Now, I know we need to figure out the class character and all this, and these Pew polls don't
Okay, I
help
see.
with that. But it does seem like the progressives were able to benefit, and actually so was the mainstream Democratic Party, was able to benefit of the seeming activity of the DSA, and has now also kind of squashed its electoral hopes entirely, while the DSA is still throwing money at them. Honestly, they really are. I mean, it's something to the tune of $100,000 going to the Green New Deal and the PRO Act campaigns. So somebody asking who's associated with the outsider left. That's a problem, is because the outsider left was defined by everybody who identified as leftist, including some socialists who did not clearly fit into some other major Democratic Party faction. So there's some people in there who are actually pretty moderate, and then there's socialist in it. And it's a mess.
Yeah. I guess, okay, so let me try to take a stab at this. I would say that rather than orienting towards, whatever category, a Pew poll might talk about, we should think about it as, starting with our own independent Marxist principles, right? And for me, that means, our platform, even though I have a lot of criticisms of the platform, it's at least an official document that states what our political positions are. And that's obviously, we don't have a majority for all those. Like they would sound crazy to a lot of people. I think there was some race somewhere where some Democratic Party politician caught whiff of, or actually read the first draft of the platform before the whole thing was published, and they were like, they want full nuclear disarmament. Like, these guys are crazy, and that actually got its way into the media, which I was thrilled about. But yeah, the independent Marxist position, even if people are unconscious Marxists, I think is definitely a minority position in the country. But I would argue that we need to consolidate around whatever that minority is. And yeah, it's true that Marxists do support, what would be called progressive things. We support Black liberation. We support women's emancipation. Blah blah blah. And we shouldn't shy away from those things because they're seen as cutting into bread and butter demands. But I think there's a way to kind of frame discussion around oppression and stuff like that as part of a universalist program of emancipation, which is what I think Marxism is about. There's also obviously the capitalist class has co-opted a lot of that language easily. But I would just say that we have to think about these issues in a Marxist framework, which I don't think the whole intersectionality framework does. I think that intersectionality kind of makes class kind of one of the spokes on the wheel of oppression or whatever, and you don't think about things in their historical context, in the sense that, okay, racialization was an invention of mainly the later 17th century, not 1619, but the 1670s and 1680s, as Noel Ignatieff and Ted Allen have written about. And why was racialization a thing? Well, it was for labor discipline to keep the continued accumulation of capital through the super exploitation of slaves. So, obviously we're getting into theoretical grounds and not, political messaging here. But when you take the Marxist approach, I think you can have a consistent approach towards human liberation that put that in a framework that's towards universal emancipation. I'm getting kind of tangential to your original question now, but yeah, I do think the best bet is to put out an actual Marxist framework and consolidate everyone who can be consolidated around that, and work from there to win a majority of support for the socialist program. I think that's kind of an unpopular view within DSA, because obviously it's hard to get elected on a minority position. But I think, if we're smart strategically and tactically, we can make wins. And I've been talking a lot about politics tonight, but it's not just on the political level, it's on the shop floor. It's on, there are all sorts of other work DSA members are doing. I think most DSA members would say that political and trade union work is the most important work we're doing. But again, that's a tactical question. So I'll leave it there for that one.
All right. There's a lot of stuff that came up that I could talk about, but I think I'm not going to. The only thing I would say, backtracking a bit, is that I do get somewhat frustrated with the bourgeois Labor Party talk coming out of the Trotskyist and Trotsky adjacent factions of the DSA, because they seem to ignore the history of workers' parties, where they come out of long coalitions of unions and internationals, and that in America, that's literally illegal. So that pathway of building that party is not there. And I think that's something people should understand, that Taft-Hartley was actually aimed at making sure there was no U.S. Labor Party. The Democrats wanted to make sure labor would remain a captive demographic, and the GOP of Eisenhower, which is a very distant GOP than now, but wanted to make sure there were no dirty socialists in the country, and that together, functioned that way. And the CPUSA at the time had no reason to oppose it, because they maintained the Popular Front till last year. So it's something I think people should know about these discussions. The only thing I would say about the United Front strategy, as spelled out by McNair and as historically held by the Second International, is that it does assume a parliamentary and not congressional legislative representation. And so it would almost take a constitutional amendment to make it viable in the U.S.
Right. Yeah, the idea that you don't join a governing coalition, right, which is totally geared towards parliamentary politics. I think in the U.S. that's more difficult, because if you're elected on the Democratic Party, a president was elected, you have no control over whether or not you're the governing party or not. But I would say it's your action. So if you're, I think it's possible to build a pure opposition party in the U.S. that doesn't enter coalition, which means don't take any positions in the administration. You can vote on bills that are positive towards enacting parts of our platform, but don't horse trade, don't compromise on your principles, and act as a pure independent opposition. Obviously it's a little bit more complicated when talking, and I think the biggest problem is it's harder to translate to people what it means, because of the difference between the presidential system and a parliamentary system.
Yeah, I think that's a huge kind of issue that hasn't been really discussed. Is not only is it for a parliamentary system and not our congressional system, but it's also for non-federated system. And in fact, the arguments against federation go all the way back to the First International, but we have inherited a federated system in the United States. I say this because I think people should be looking at these historical social positions, but also looking at the differences in law and constitutional regimes for how you would integrate that. And I know people would say also that, like, historically labor was illegal in the high point of American labor. It was illegal here too. And that's all true. But your party has to eventually be legalized to run. And so you got to have a path for that. Anyway, thank you, Parker. There'll be more discussions with different groups in the future on this. I will say you have made your position pretty clear. I would also say that I think these discussions are important to have, but I will state for my audience before they think that I had endorsed anything that I still wouldn't join the DSA. So people should make up their own decisions on this. And this is actually a position as a socialist that I think that I actually care more about the platform of what people think the content of socialism is than where they think that struggle should be. However, that is going to require somebody to file into some national level organizations and international level organizations at some point. And so that does seem to be something we have to realistically talk about, and taking a totally cynical answer towards even having the discussion is a non-starter, because it's been easy to do. The sectarian left's been doing that since the 50s. And we should admit that the sectarian left in America has historically been some of the most useless organizations in the history of mankind. So, I think we have to look at that. I also think there's some people point out the Second International failed. I think that's a fair point. What you have to discern there, and I'm not in the capacity to do it in 5 minutes at the end of a stream today, if you think it failed because of its strategy, or if you think it failed because it didn't stick to its strategy, because the evidence, as I've read it, could support either interpretation of the history, because there was deviations from the strategy. I mean, the whole war, the war bonds thing is an indication that there was deviations of the strategy in which the Russian and oddly the American socialist parties took the right side. That's a weird history. It's like the US actually took the right side on that debate, but nobody else.
Most of them were Germans.
Yeah, fair. But it's something, and I think we have to look at. But I also think we do have to look at new strategies, and with dealing with the legality of the situation in the United States, and what kind of collection of tactics and strategies you're going to use. So all that's a bigger question I can answer on a stream. I'm going to let you go. Thank everybody for coming out.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it was fun. I will send this one to my editor to clean up the audio, and it'll be out as a podcast for people to listen to probably in about 3 weeks.
Great.
Take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.